pattern of our society's holiday season basically begins with feasting at Thanksgiving and in a wave of successive parties for work, school, and church that begin early in December, as well as community treat and candy giving galore. We never really stop feasting until we get back to work and school after the new year. A rough 40 days of tendency to excess. Inevitably, by the time things return back to normal after the new year, many if not most people in society feel a compelling need to fast. We don't like things to sound very religious these days, so we'll dress things up with secular sounding concepts like New Year's resolutions and diets. But fasting has traditionally meant voluntarily imposing limitations on oneself, most commonly in the realms of what you eat, for a higher purpose. So what are most New Year's resolutions and diets in reality but fasts? Especially because of the feelings of guilt and reeling oneself back in that are often involved. There are a few sad things, in my opinion, about this pattern we've established as a society. One of these is that by the time we've reached the culminating event of the season, Christmas Day, we've had so much feasting, so many parties, so much pre-celebration, that the event itself has a certain tragic character. Of course, the anticipation and novelty of opening presents still leaves most people, especially children, with an excitement that lasts through the opening hours of Christmas morning. But at least in my experience, what follows quite naturally these days is a precipitous drop in energy, oftentimes with a tinge of melancholy that no one really wants to acknowledge. In my observation, many people tend to collapse post-present opening into a vegetative state, accompanied by movie marathons, naps, and whatever remains of the goodies spread out on the kitchen counter, while children play with their new novelties and deal with the fact that reality never quite measures up to the anticipation. Forgive me if I feel overly a downer about this. I merely offer you what my experience has been over the years. And I'd like to think that I'm not the only one who has felt that there's something off about this pattern. That at the very moment when the most important thing symbolically arrives into the world, the culmination of the season, the world sputters momentarily and then descends into a coma. I openly acknowledge that your own experience may be something entirely different from this in your part of the world and in your home and your traditions. Or if you do recognize some common experience, maybe it hasn't been so dramatic as I portrayed it. And if that's the case, I'm genuinely pleased to hear that. But I share my experience because it was my surprise to discover in recent years what will come as no surprise to Catholics and Orthodox Christians, that the original pattern of the season did not contain these problems because it went in exact reverse order. The fasting came before the feasting. This fasting can vary by tradition, but typically consisted and still consists to this day of a voluntary limiting of the available food choices, oftentimes most animal products. My intention in this video is not to push a particular religious tradition, because as it turns out, there's many traditions that still maintain this pattern. My purpose instead is to highlight this particular pattern, because if this idea is new to you, like it was to me, and you have faced the same kind of dissatisfaction with the Christmas season as I had over the years, then this may be of interest to you, because theoretically anyone could implement it. Think through with me how the dynamic of Christmas changes if you reverse the pattern and fast first. Anyone who is experienced with a diet or an exercise regime or an intense course of study, especially when these are directed toward a positive culminating event, will recognize both the difficulty but also the meaning, the fulfillment that can come in doing something difficult directed towards something higher, especially if it came of your own initiative rather than as a response to something that you regret. The deprivation or voluntary sacrifice turns your anticipation to the event, but in the way that makes the event the culmination of your efforts, an anticipation of celebration rather than the letdown of a cessation of celebration. The fast frames the feast and imbues it with positive importance. If you've ever fasted or trained or sacrificed with a group in anticipation of an event, say a sports team training for a tournament, then you'll know how you can be brought closer together with others through your shared sacrifice in service of a common goal, amplifying the meaning of the season. Under society's current pattern, you do get to share in that togetherness in the feasting portion of the season. But when it comes to the fasting, it's much more typical for every person to go their own way in crafting themselves an idiosyncratic mix comprised of any number of latest health trends or training regimens. The image that always pops up in my mind is everyone lined up at a salad bar of health trends, practices taken from other cultures, and scientific studies. And each person crafts their own preferred salad based on their own whims, which never quite match up with anyone else's. The ancient pattern maintains the togetherness through both the fasting and the feasting, where both phases have a positive character, rather than the fasting period feeling like something of a penance for misdeeds, dare I say sins, missings of the mark. When you put the fasting before the feasting, the Advent season becomes like the ocean, pulling back into itself in anticipation of a tsunami, a good tsunami, not a destructive one. And when the culminating tsunami arrives on Christmas Day, it's not just an instantaneous event. The crest of the wave is most impressive, of course, but the wave continues to come in and wash up onto the shore, followed by a slow diminishment rolling back into the sea. The 12 days of Christmas we sing about in the song were 12 days of continuous feasting and festivity in one form or another that began on Christmas Day and didn't stop until after the New Year. Today, that song doesn't really make sense, or that concept of continuous feasting after Christmas. But if you've been fasting for over a month, then you have the energy for successive days of feasting, singing, dancing, and other merrymaking. The trick, of course, if you want to try this pattern out, is to convince other people to do it with you, or conform yourself to communities that still follow the pattern. Otherwise, it's just one more way to isolate ourselves off from each other. As we're in the second season of doing this as a family with a small supportive community around us, our Christmas season has been different, with trade-offs in that you're not joining as much with the rest of society. But on the whole, our experience has been that it solves those contradictions we were experiencing before. Christmas, and really all celebration, is a difficult thing in our world of mixture and pluralities, because we're struggling so much to define our identities and what brings us together as a society and why. So I offer this pattern not with insistence, but merely with possibility, and I leave it for your consideration. I wish you the best in your efforts of fasting, feasting, community, and celebration.